Okay. The first question is, how would you describe your childhood and adolescence?
Adolescence.
Oy vey. You know what oy vey is? Yiddish.
No.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
It's a long story, but I will try to make it short. My childhood, and obviously this is in the frame of an LGBT, understanding of LGBT.
Yeah.
I realised that I wasn't like an ordinary little girl very early. Very early.
Yeah.
So, and I was very much what they call in this country a tomboy. And unfortunately, my parents gave me a name that didn't shorten to a boy's name. You know, some girls are given names which can shorten to a boy's name, but my name, Elizabeth, didn't shorten to anything. So I called myself John. Okay, because it didn't shorten to anything. And I had an older brother who's 4.5 years older than me, and I've got a younger sister, 3.5 years younger than me, and I called her Jimmy. So I was John, and I called my sister Jimmy. I don't know whether she liked it or not. I didn't, but that's what I did. So I really had a boy's identity, because this is one of the reasons I'm writing this book about binary tyranny. Because, it's bad enough now, but you go back, I was born in 1955, okay? So you go back to then, it was very strict binary tyranny. So there weren't many options. So I preferred the being a boy option to the being a girl. I never played with dolls. I wasn't interested in any of that. I actually started developing very early, which was a shock. So by the time I was 12, I was fully developed. And this was a terrible shock to me. And then I didn't want it at all. So adolescence was a very depressing time. Very, very depressing. Because with my body changing, I was suddenly I couldn't avoid being a girl, a young woman. And this brought, it was traumatic. It was traumatic. Now, as it happens, I was actually one of the first people in the class to have a boyfriend when I was 12. But I gave up boys at 14. By the age of 14, in fact it was my 14th birthday, first of all I was an absolute feminist, so I couldn't stand the way boys treated you. I was a very strong character, and I said, that's it, I'm not having anything more to do with boys. So what I did was become very studious. So instead of having boyfriends, I became a good student. That was a way out. There was quite a lot of pressure on me, though, in my late teens, from different people, not particularly from my parents, but from other people. So a couple of people dragged me along to Jewish Youth Club. I hated it. I hated any of this stuff. I was better being on my own, but I was a very depressed teenager, because I felt very isolated and alone. I didn't think there was anybody like me. And in fact, I got married when I was 19. I got married to, this was the way out. It might sound funny to you, but in a society where the whole expectation is you should have a boyfriend, and you should do this and do that, the easiest way out of that is to find one. Find one who's a nice, decent person who's not going to give you a hard time, and then you can relax. Okay? So in fact, the person I started going out with just after my 18th birthday, I met him at a mutual cousin's wedding. So we had cousins on either side of the family in common. I met him there, and I thought, this is great. Everybody knows him, so it's going to be family. He's not family biologically, and that was the easiest thing, was to go out with him. That was the easiest thing to do, and so I started going out with him when I was just 18. And my parents didn't even want me to get married. They were quite progressive. I went to university, a London School of Economics, and but I just thought, to me that was a solution, was to get married. So I got married in March 1975. So that's 41 years ago. I'm now nearly 61. And I thought that would work. I thought that would. And he was very open and progressive, and we went to all the gay theatre productions together. And he was happy for me to be a tomboy. I wore just jeans and jackets, and with him I could be myself. He was like a nice brother. He was like a nice brother. But then I fell in love with a woman. And I realised it wasn't going to, I couldn't keep that going any longer. So when I was, we'd been married 3.5 years, and I left him. Yeah.
So, did you realize early on that you were maybe not, they somewhat like women?
Oh, definitely. I mean, when I was a little girl, I had relationships with girls.
Yeah.
When I was a little girl.
Was it hard for you, for your surroundings to understand, maybe your parents? Or
Well, no, but nobody, I mean, you know, children pick up what the dominant culture is, you know? So when I was young, I went to, well, we have it on a Saturday, but I went on a Sunday to the Sunday school of the synagogue. And there was a little girl there. We'd go after Sunday's lessons, we'd go back to each other's houses and, you know, and fool around. And I was, how old was I? 7, 8, 9? I was very young.
Yeah, that's young.
So, and I'm not quite sure why that was something, because I know for a lot of young people they're much older, and I'm not sure. I think it was tied up with this awareness that I was different. I'm not quite sure how that was. But everything happened to me quite early. So as I say, by 12 I was fully developed. So I went from the shock of having a very clear kind of identity that I was happy with, to dealing with the trauma of having to adapt to something else. But by the time I was 23 when I left my husband, and that's when I came out. The next question.
We've been informed that in 1984, during your rabbinic studies at Leo
Beck
College, you and another student, Sheila Schulman, were put on probation of 5 years.
That's right. It's in my book as well. The whole thing's in my book, so you can read it there as well, in my introduction. But yeah, the thing is that we were both in a Jewish lesbian group. Yeah. And it's a long story how we both decided to become rabbis. But I can say from my part that I made a decision, first of all, that being outside everything was not going to change the world. No. And the way I wanted to change it was via my context, my cultural context. So I thought that by becoming a rabbi and getting involved in the mainstream, I could have an impact on mainstream Judaism to make it more inclusive of gender and sexuality, and have, you know, the sort of power and authority in that context to do something. So that was a major reason for becoming a rabbi. The other major reason was to do with, there's a book by a man called Emil Fackenheim, and in it he talked about, thou shalt not give Hitler a posthumous victory, as an additional commandment. Now, what does that mean? It means Hitler, after his death, has an additional victory if Jews stop being Jews. So I felt that I had a responsibility to help keep the Jewish community alive. So I both wanted to do something for the Jewish community to ensure its future, but also for women and lesbians and gay people, LGBT, to make the Jewish community more inclusive. But when both of us decided to apply to be rabbis at the same time, there'd never been any lesbian rabbis. So when we went to the Leobeck College, they said, what do we do? So the probation is normally 1 year. It's a 5-year program. All students put on 1 year probation. But they put us on probation for 5 years because they didn't know what was going to happen. Would people object to us? So they said to us, you know, we don't know what's going to happen. We may have to get rid of you. We don't know. So we'd say, well, what might we do that you'd have to do that? They said, well, we don't know. It depends if people object. So this meant we had to be really excellent. We had to be, and the funny thing is, we were the only 2 students to get distinctions. We were the best students. Okay, it's not surprising. It's only 5 students in our year, and we were the only women as well. Because obviously, when that amount of pressure, you have to prove something. So I was busy proving something, but that really went on. And the other thing was, right at the end, when we were due to be ordained. Both of us, there were 2 progressive movements in England. One's called Liberal, one's called Reform. This is in the Liberal movement. But I started off in the Reform movement because I knew some people in it. And the head of the Reform at that time, he called me into his office 3 weeks before my ordination to say, I know I can't stop you being ordained, but I want to let you know, I want you to know that I don't think you should be.
Oh, how was that like?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we dealt with all along.
Yeah.
And that's only, I mean, there were later struggles, I talk about it in my book, there were later struggles, because I got involved in 1996 campaigning for a same-sex marriage, and I had to leave the reform movement around that issue. So I've been a fighter the whole time.
Have you gained any opposition from other Jewish congregations?
Of course. And but you know, on a personal level, my belief, when I first, there was a vacancy at this synagogue in July 1997, when I was leaving the reform movement over the issue of same-sex marriage.
Oh.
And they would not even call me to an interview. 3 years later, there was a vacancy again. And I had another go. Because my experience tells me that if you engage with people, I believe you can change hearts and minds. Yeah. There are some people, and I suppose this is where my starting point was it's all terrible, it's all patriarchy, it's all the homophobia, you can't do anything, don't get involved. But as soon as I decided to get involved, I discovered that you can change people's minds. Yeah. And when my wife and I, she's actually an artist, that's her painting on the front cover, one of her paintings. When we got married in the synagogue, March 26, 2006, 10 years ago, half the synagogue congregation turned up for our wedding. There were old people coming out crying, saying it was the most beautiful wedding they'd ever been to. This year's the 10th anniversary. It will fall on a Saturday. We're having a special celebration with the service. She and I will lead the service. We'll both give part of the sermon together. When I first applied here in July 1997, that would have been, if you'd said that that could happen, you'd say, impossible.
Yeah, it's a change.
But change is possible.
Yes.
Change is possible.
Yeah.